sexual morality, for instance. It's clear to see that if we understand liberalism as an appeal to the autonomy principle at heart, then we're going to be very uncomfortable with any restrictions, any constraints placed on our actions. This explains why we've suddenly become uncomfortable having laws on public morality, having laws on sexual morality, and one by one, all these laws have been steadily removed. So it's very good at explaining those kinds of events if we start from the ideas. But what I would submit is missing in this conversation is often the institutional commitments that mid 20th century, even 19th century liberals had. And that, I submit, is something else that changed at the latter part of the 20th century, is we stopped thinking about liberalism as a system that required us to have a particular set of institutions. And we started to think about it more in terms of the idea, the idyllic principle. We love the grand story of these different ideas that are kind of moving through time and people debating them. But we have to remember that for Plato, for Aristotle, when they're describing the character of a regime, what matters is how the law shapes the soul. And if you change the law, if you change the institutions, you're going to change the kinds of people that are inside them.
Welcome to Inside Policy Talks, podcast of the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. I'm Peter Copeland, Deputy Director of Domestic Policy here at MLI. Across the Western world, nations are struggling to define who they are and who they want to become. Migration, identity, and belonging have moved from policy questions to existential ones. And at the same time, the political and moral assumptions that held our societies together for decades are starting to unravel, and we're seeing deep tension between those who want to defend the open liberal order and those who believe the very openness has gone a bit too far, eroding belonging, stability, and moral coherence. So what comes next? Are we watching the liberal order evolve, adapt, and change, or decay? To help us think through these questions, I'm joined by Nathan Pinkoski, Senior Fellow at the Center for Renewing America and a political theorist who's taught at the University of Florida, Princeton, and Toronto. He's now in Washington, but is himself a Canadian, so we may have to repatriate him at some point. His work traces the decline of liberal constitutionalism, the rise of what he calls actually existing post-liberalism, and the cultural and civilizational pressures reshaping Western politics. Before we get started, please remember to like and subscribe. It really helps us reach more people with these conversations. Nathan, thanks for being here.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a delight to be on the show.
So let's start with what you've written about the liberal consensus, that we're living through the breakdown of it. From your perspective, what makes this moment different from other, tension points that political orders experience and adapt through over time?
Yeah, so I think one of the things we have to do is drop the notion that there exists right now existent so-called liberal order, often termed a post-liberal order, post-war liberal order, or rules-based order, or that it's been subject to challenges just in the last few years that weren't there before, or something of that sort. What I think has been happening for some time, for decades, is we have a political imaginary that we describe ourselves as. We attribute the way we think as, let's call it liberal or post-war liberalism, but it doesn't match on to the description of reality. It doesn't match on to the description of how our institutions actually work, how they've changed over time. Some of them, of course, have changed quite a bit in the last decade, but others have changed substantially for decades. And what's, I think, key here is to focus on this notion of post-war. because the aura of legitimacy that we have when we're talking about grand arguments about the directions we're on or our crises, so many of them make reference to the end of the Second World War, to 1945, to the kinds of institutions that emerge from that particular moment, and with good reason. Of course, this was a very important moment in world history, in Western history, and the great deal of new institutions were designed to ensure that something like the Second World War would not happen again. But I think that we have seen, and it's not just people in the past few years, it's been in a much longer conversation, people pointing out that the way those institutions were designed, the kind of consensus that was established at the end of the Second World War no longer holds. So one example that's very much part of the mainstream that has persuaded me is the notion that the economic assumptions, or the political economic assumptions that underlay the post-war moment broke down, stopped being adhered to sometime in the 1970s. A couple obvious ones that feature in this argument is this is the argument that people developed just to help us follow along here, that we move from a kind of post-war consensus of embedded liberalism to something called neoliberalism. And features of this change will be that the post-war setup was one that relied considerably on capital controls. It relied on fixed exchange rates. And you would also have autonomous monetary policy. We still have a bit of that, although, of course, in Europe, because of the euro, that's been traded away as well. We can get to that in a moment if we need. But we now live in a world where capital controls are outre. Almost no country around the planet uses them or only invokes them in particular instances. So it's a world of capital mobility. It's a world of floating exchange rates. And this has been part of, again, a very mainstream academic criticism that the way we ordered our economic institutions changed considerably in the 1970s and 1980s. The usual figures who feature in this analysis will be, say, Thatcher, Reagan. Recently, people point out that if you're, say, talking about central bank policy, say, in the United States, a key feature of getting inflation under control, well, who appointed the central banker who did that? Well, it was Jimmy Carter. So the timeline for this goes back a little further, and you can't simply tell a story about the rise of conservatism or the rise of a new right in the 1980s. It's actually a bipartisan consensus. A lot of these economic decisions take place. And this is one side of the breakdown that, again, is very much part of the mainstream, and I think goes to counter, or at least is in tension with a lot of the people who invoke a post-war liberal order that has just been attacked, say, in the last few years because of right-wing populism or left-wing populism or some combination of both. It's actually been a very significant change in the way that we order our economic and political institutions, and it's been going on for some time. Now, here's the part that I'm persuaded by that is not part of the mainstream that I think we have to reckon with. It's that the post-war liberal understanding was one that was in tension with what has become asymmetrical multiculturalism. So I would submit that liberalism, on the one hand, is distinct and different from another regime type, which we can call asymmetrical multiculturalism. What I mean by that is the notion that and here, I'm thinking of the scholar Eric Kaufman, who's written on this subject, that in a modern Western polity, there is a sort of basic taboo put in place by which the majority, the white majority, has to govern itself by. And that is, you are not allowed to assert or have any reference to your ethnic identity. You can't speak about yourself in that term. But, and here's the asymmetrical part, but that taboo is combined with an exhortation, almost an imperative, that the minority groups get to exalt their ethnic identity, their cultural status, and indeed it is the role of the state to promote that, to help advance that and push that along. And this is, I think, the underlying assumption that goes with a lot of civil rights law, a lot of anti-discrimination law. It's not actually in practice, and indeed in many countries, the way it's written, it's not actually a colorblind legislation. It's not saying we don't require we require everyone to be subject to the same standard, and what we're just trying to ensure is the colorblind application of the law. In many countries, some minority groups will qualify as protected groups. The majority one may not, and is not qualified as a protected group, protected category. So we have, on the one hand, we have this major economic change that's been going on since the 70s and 80s. And that's changed a lot of our institutions. And on the other hand, we have this, what I'm calling a new regime type, this asymmetrical multiculturalism, that has displaced a lot of the assumptions that underrode kind of mid 20th century understanding of how rights worked, how what kind of obligations were placed on the peoples, and indeed transformed our understanding of equality. Because on the last kind of approach, the goal is not to ensure equal treatment at the point of, say, where you come into contact with the law. The point is actually to ensure that the minority groups get an elevated status, and the state evolves in that. So these are two changes that both, I'd submit, have been going on since the 1970s, but I think they really took off in the 1990s and have pushed the other world behind. So just to wrap up quickly what I'm suggesting here, that sometime in the 1990s, we underwent a kind of quiet revolution. This was the period where a lot of our intellectuals were saying this is the culmination of a liberal order. This is just the fulfillment of things that we had at 1945. Maybe you agree with this liberal order. Maybe you want to criticize it. Maybe you want to agree that we're at the end of history, or suggest that it's not quite there. It's more limited to, say, our countries or a couple nations around the world. But in fact, this was the moment whereby quietly, the quiet revolution idea, that we were leaving decisively a lot of the old tenets and a lot of the old presuppositions behind. And that's where we are today.
Okay, fascinating tour through last 50 or so years. I want to make sure I've got it right. So the liberal post-war rules-based order involves mostly setting up institutions to create this kind of level playing field in which people are free to choose and move around, and the state should be neutral to allow that freedom of exchange of ideas and people and what have you, and that over time we would just become more and more I suppose, secular and universalist and all of these sorts of things, a kind of conformity. And the economic change was that moving in the 70s, we moved away from those kind of features that would preserve a kind of neutrality or level playing field, for lack of a better word, to one that no longer did. And similarly with the idea of culture, rather than a level playing field, you get a kind of inversion where it's now the non-dominant, the minorities that the state power tips the scale towards. What are some of the other changes? First, do I have that right? And what are some of the other changes that represent this here? And the other part of the argument I want to understand is whether you think that liberalism's features, when emphasized to a certain extent, necessarily or would strongly suggest that you get this kind of outcome.
Yeah, those are great questions. So yeah, I'd agree with your setup there. That's a very helpful, quick characterization of the landscape. Just a couple other points to add is, I think what's particularly interesting and what we should focus on is the way that some of our institutional obligations change. So we can talk about let's put it like this. If we're talking about neutrality, what we're talking about is that the state has limited power to work in the sphere of civil society. Civil society is supposed to be independent we're supposed to step back from state power, use of state power, to ensure that that happens. And just to give an example here, one way in which multiculturalism is in tension with that is if you think the task of the government is to sponsor, to support, to carve out specific legal protections for a certain group, or indeed ensure that it's easier for those outside the country to come in to keep growing the size of that group, then you're not talking anymore about a neutrality paradigm at work. It's something else going on with respect to civil society.
Mhm.
The other side of it too, as the critics of neoliberalism point out too, is that to make the notion of a self-regulating market work, it is a kind of utopic thought. It's one that actually requires considerable state intervention to ensure that that happens over time. So again, the notion of an independent society, independent civil society, becomes eroded. And these are a couple of things that we should watch. Final example of that, and then jump into your fascinating question about whether this was baked into liberal thinking all along. Final point I should add is we should also think about the international dynamic of this, the way that international institutions change. So I'll give one example. After the Second World War and the process of it coming to an end, when Bretton Woods is established, it's supposed to be the role of the International Monetary Fund to enforce to police the rules of Bretton Woods. So basically, to ensure that other countries stay within the currency brackets. They're allowed to deviate, but only a small amount, and basically to keep the exchange rates fixed. Has a couple other duties, of course, but the task is to preserve the system impartially. So not to bring politics in, not to say, well, it's actually beneficial at this moment to for the Germans to float the Deutschmark. Everyone needs to abide by the same set of rules. And of course, the big shock in 1971 is one where the Nixon administration in secret decides we're going to take the U.S. off the gold standard, so breaks Bretton Woods, also devaluing the U.S. dollar. So they broke the rules of Bretton Woods, and according to the terms, quite rightly, there are reasons that happened. But just from the perspective of following the neutral rules, people immediately pointed out, "You've broken the rules. This should be a scandal," as it was. Fast forward to the mid 1990s, and the IMF is being used to bail out the Russian government in preparation for Yeltsin's reelection. And we have the evidence to support this, and indeed it was a sort of minor scandal at the time that Clinton called up the IMF, more or less, and said, you need to give the Russians a major loan right now so they can use that money to help Yeltsin win re-election. That's a major change in the way that institution is used. It's the politicization of it. Again, might be good reasons that that decision took place, but it's not being used the same way that it was supposed to be used. It's not being run in the same way as it was run in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. So these are the kinds of changes that I think we should pay attention to. I think particularly when we look at the international sphere too, this is dear to a lot of people who talk about the post-war liberal order under attack, because they often assume that the international system is still functioning the same way it does. The rules are still in place, the institutions are still in place, and they're still operating the same way. But I would submit that they have not. Now, your other question, I think, is a great one for a discussion. And this is a little bit of a tension in my own account, because there are a lot of people who, when they discuss what liberalism is, focus on a set of ideas and see the course of that ideas moving through time and look at the logic of that and how it plays out. And I think that's very useful when we're talking, say, about certain domains like sexual morality, for instance. It's clear to see that if we understand liberalism as an appeal to the autonomy principle at heart, then we're going to be very uncomfortable with any restrictions, any constraints placed on our actions. And that's going to involve, of course, constraints on or running up against constraints on sexual morality. And then you look at, say, what's happened with respect to the sexual revolution in the past 50, 60 years, and you have a good account as to why that happened. You could say at least, well, look, this is the liberal principle at work. This explains why we've suddenly become uncomfortable having laws on public morality, having laws on sexual morality, and one by one, all these laws have been steadily removed. So it's very good at explaining those kinds of events if we start from the ideas, from the simple ideas. But what I would submit is missing in this conversation is often the institutional commitments that mid 20th century, even 19th century liberals had. And the big one that is there in the 19th century and comes up again in the 20th century, mid 20th century, particularly after the Second World War, right, where a lot of concerns had been about dictatorship, the rise of the abuse of executive power to set up dictatorships. Liberals were committed to a very thick system of representative government, strong powers for parliament, strong powers for the legislature. And the Constitution of the Fourth Republic in France was designed that way. Of course, you have the British example, a very strong parliamentary system, and the German example as well. And courts, when they played a role in this, were not what we think of courts as today, like, oh, someone's violated my rights, therefore I appeal to the Supreme Court. Courts in Europe especially didn't have that power to exercise judicial review like that. Their job was to monitor the executive and legislative branches and ensure that they stayed within the rules of the constitutional system. So if the parliament started to exercise powers it didn't have this is on continental Europe, right? I'm not talking about Britain. Then that's where you jump in. But what's key here is a story about liberalism as having certain institutional commitments that are above all important. And that, I submit, is something else that changed at the latter part of the 20th century, is we stopped thinking about liberalism as a system that required us to have a particular set of institutions. And we started to think about it more in terms of the idea, the idyllic principle of like autonomy, and things of that sort. So in the first place, I think we just need to take a step back and ask what our definition of liberalism is and what's been missed by a lot of the thinkers who just want to focus on a more theoretical principle rather than thinking about what it institutionally meant.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and to the question of the tensions that emerge. So maybe you can get at this, get at your answer this way, whether it necessarily or should lead in a certain direction, if its key tenets, either ideological or in institutional form, are emphasized to a great degree. But what are its tensions that have led to what you describe as this kind of disintegrating of the liberal world order, where it is now pervasively, I suppose, imposed on aspects of society where hitherto it did not claim, at least in the same way, to intrude upon.
So tensions here in the understanding of liberalism that I'm proposing, the institutional understanding.
What leads from those tensions to where we are today, which is kind of like an erosion or collapse of some of its claims to neutrality.
Well, one, I think, is what I alluded to with the role of the courts. And again, I'm prioritizing here institutional change. So thinking about the institutional pressures and not so much the contest between different kinds of ideas. But I think the institutional story is worth paying attention to because it explains a lot about what has happened. So I think coming out of the Second World War, a lot of countries were thought that there was should be a greater role for courts than had existed beforehand. Again, a lot of this is tied up to enforcing the kind of balance of powers, if you will, the adjudicating potential conflicts between different branches, not thinking about judicial review as a Bill of Rights enforcements. That's unique to the American case, or well, pretty close. But what happens, I think, is a desire to imitate countries that are adopting or have adopted that kind of thicker conception of judicial review. A lot of it is, frankly, the desire of Western European countries, and including Canada, to copy the American system. To look at the actions undertaken by the Warren Court and thinking, wouldn't it be great if we had something like that here?
Mm-hmm.
And in the post-war setup, I think people were particularly vulnerable to that because what I'd say is we'd agreed for a greater role for the courts, but we hadn't thought about just how far, or just how it could go way off in a particular direction. It's not there in the tradition of classical liberalism to think about the court, to think about the judiciary as the most dangerous branch. The most dangerous branch, I'm borrowing here from the Federalist Papers, the most dangerous branch is the legislature. Coming out of the 1930s, if you think of the most dangerous branch in government, you're probably thinking of a potentially abusive executive.
Mm-hmm.
The chancellor who will declare himself or declare a state of emergency and then push an enabling act through Parliament, right? These are the kinds of examples that you're thinking of. So we were not really set to think seriously about what it would look like if the judiciary took on more and more powers at the expense of the other branches. So when people proposed more powers for the judiciary, it sounded very benign. It sounded like it was often just in continuity with what had already taken place.
Mm-hmm.
But we see the popularity of that system really started to take off. And here's where I think the Canadian example is particularly important in our kind of history of the West here. Because the Europeans actually were, despite their reputation nowadays, were very reticent to give courts immense powers, very hesitant to adopt anything that looked like what we would now call an activist judiciary. Mm-hmm. But this was a key moment in Western history with the repatriation of the Constitution. To set up a charter of rights required you to give the court immense power to enforce that. And it's actually a funny little anecdote about this. Remember, at the time, to repatriate the Constitution, you needed to have British Parliament sign off on it because of the nature of the system. And at that particular moment, this is the early 1980s, the Thatcher government has other priorities. There's also the Falklands issue going on as well. So they just wanted to run this through, give Pierre Trudeau, remember he's back in power now, this is his final term, to give him basically whatever he wants. And they just wanted to rubber stamp the process and move on. But it was actually Tony Benn, kind of a hard left member of the Labour Party, who looked at what was happening with this proposal to set up a Charter of Rights and Freedom and said, well, hold on now, this is something that is going to go against the whole parliamentary tradition. How can you call yourself a Westminster parliamentarian system after this? Because you're making the court sovereign. You're taking away the sovereignty of Parliament and making the court sovereign. And this set off then a big debate in Canada, of which many provinces took leadership, including, of course, the great province of Alberta, where I was born, took up leadership on this and said, we have to change this process because if we allow it to go through as it's being proposed, the Supreme Court will be sovereign and Parliament will be stripped of any power. Now, what's important here for my story is what they're holding on to, people like Peter Lougheed, people like Tony Benn, is very much a kind of post-war vision that the predominant power should be the representative power, the most representative power, and that's, of course, the legislature. So the upshot of this is that back and forth barbs are traded, and the compromise is what we now know in the Charter as Section 33, right? Mm-hmm. Itself a very controversial principle nowadays because we have people who want to push for taking judicial review further and further. Mm-hmm. But these are the kinds of big institutional changes that get left out if we talk about liberalism as autonomy or something like that. And they really are revolutionary, right? This has changed the whole way that Canada is governed. It's changed what Parliament can and cannot do. And it certainly made the court much more important in our national politics in ways that older generations don't realize or just have begun to realize in the past few years.
Yes, certainly. And just to tie it back to this broader question of what's in tension and why did these institutional and ideological developments occur that moved away from this ideal of neutrality? What is your case there? I mean, I would from my vantage point, suggest that some of the common fabric, norms, beliefs, these sorts of things, upon which this institutional picture of liberalism, and the ideological one, miss or take for granted. Why do we see, whether it's at through monetary policy or through immigration or through the courts or through other types of institutional kind of putting the thumb on the scales, so to speak, for the liberal open order? Why do you start to see that occur more and more?
Well, a lot of the things is, and I guess I'm doubling down here on my idea that we tend to rely too much on ideas to explain what's happening.
Yeah.
A lot of it is to do with the changes in law and the changes in the Constitution. And this is a very Aristotelian point. It's very much a kind of a point that I think is at the core of classical political philosophy that we've perhaps lost sight of, because many intellectuals, myself included, love the history of ideas. We love the grand story of these different ideas that are kind of moving through time and people debating them. But we have to remember that for Plato, for Aristotle, when they're describing the character of a regime, what matters is how the law shapes the soul. And if you change the law, if you change the institutions, you're going to change the kinds of people that are inside them, the way that they think. And sometimes you can have, and if this is true, right, you can have a law set up for very benign reasons, one that gets taken off in directions that are much more malicious. Or people pass a law and they think that this is no big deal to pass a law like this, but in fact, the law has momentous consequences that reshape how everyone is acting within them. So I really think we should focus on some of these major changes.
Okay.
Give a Canadian example, right? When multiculturalism is first passed, is proposed as part of it, it's not even clear this is a major change in Canada. People say to this day that what was the multiculturalism thing about? Why was Trudeau interested in doing that? Timeline here is the early 1970s. Is, well, this is really just a response to Quebec separatism. It's a way to handle that problem, to declare that English Canada is effectively multicultural, to kind of lower down the conflict that there is between English and French Canada. One explanation that is given. Other people say that this was more of a consciously thought out project. That said, 30 years later, that's mattered immensely for the way that a lot of Canadians think about themselves, a lot of the ways that they think about what their country is ultimately about. It's become a kind of a guiding principle to reshape a lot of our other, not just legislation, but the way that our institutions operate, that they have to function according to those terms. It's meant that a lot of people in English Canada are very uncomfortable with the way that Quebec organizes its own affairs and views those as working against multiculturalism, hostile to multiculturalism, so therefore hostile to the whole ethos of Canada, even though we don't, at least politically, that's a very dangerous point to articulate if you're running for office, because it means that you might lose more seats in Quebec, right? This is why the Liberal Party doesn't talk too much about that sort of thing in Quebec. That's why the term multiculturalism is not used in Quebec. They use other terms, at least when it comes to the political debates around that. People are very careful about how they use that term. But these are the kinds of changes we should be looking at. So it's not so much here the tension is implicit in a certain set of ideas. I think they play a role. But I think to really understand why certain institutions have been ratcheted up, why certain things have become very, very important, we should be thinking about how to put the legal shifts back into our understanding.
Well, certainly, yeah, and I suppose you're saying that they are driving forces, which I would certainly agree with, but there's also this question of whether, in fact, they are responses to a kind of eroding, one might say, of like the aspects that hold society together. Like they need to enforce in a certain way this kind of liberal neutral set of ideas, and by doing so, they in fact become what some would describe as illiberal or post-liberal. So I want to ask you about that now. Is that what you see occurring through these institutional and ideological changes over time? You get a kind of moving away from this neutral state idea to one in which you have a fusion between the state, between and civil society and the markets, all kind of marching to the same drumbeat.
Yeah, well, I think often what has happened here is the language of neutrality, or describe people who describe the institutions as neutral, are painting either in such broad brushes that they don't really understand how they've been operating, um, or um, or they just that's a mask to hide the actual effective principle at work. So one doctrine in American civil rights law that's very important is disparate impact, which is codified in Congress as one of the last things that George Bush Sr. did, has brought that into civil rights law. And what is going on there is, well, indeed, if the logic of it is followed through, everything is presumptively illegal if you don't have the right ratios in terms of groups. So a company that you could come at a company that only has of one particular minority group, say 5%. And if you can find other companies that are in the sector that have a higher percentage, then you look at that company and you say, well, they must be doing something illegal because their percentage is smaller than the average for other industries. Or you take it, you can. It's very flexible, the kinds of issues that you can use there.
Right.
This is not neutrality, I think, in any meaningful sense. What is going on here is that principle at work, that the deeper principle at work of asymmetrical multiculturalism. You've designed a set of legal institutions to try to elevate certain groups at the expense of others. So neutrality is not the operative principle when we're talking about a regime that is running and enforcing disparate impact. And I would submit that a lot of the people, and this is where I think the people who are really pushing this sort of thing, many of them have become much more honest, or indeed are more honest than many centrist liberals who kind of support it or nod toward it, or maybe have a bit of anxieties. They say, no, the outcome of what we're looking for, what we're actually hoping to have, is this. It's going to be this group up here at much level, and these notions of neutrality, of due process, if we're talking about the legal sphere, or meritocratic hiring, those just don't matter anymore because of these other things. And you have to admire them for their honesty for that, because what they're saying is that these principles of neutrality that governed us for some time are no longer helpful. We don't need them anymore. So I think when you follow a lot of these discussions, and I think they're particularly true in the US context around civil rights law, or at least they were until in just the past year or so, or because of another question, but because of the way the Trump administration has handled this, there's been a lot of pullback. But you can see very frank discussion about how you have to have the law operating with one set of standards for one group of people and another set of standards for another. In fact, just one example that comes to mind is there's this from the recent oral arguments before the Supreme Court on U.S. Redistricting. An aspect of civil rights law has long been interpreted by the court as requiring you to have a particular balance in majority-minority districts. Isn't quite there in the text of the law, so this is an ongoing debate. But Justice Jackson is probably the most left-wing member of the Supreme Court. She was very frank in her account as to why you need this, and she said, I'm paraphrasing a little bit, but not much. She said the analogy for this is the Disabilities Act. And the assumption there was that every organization had to build their buildings in a certain way. And then the real kicker line here is that in the context of voting laws, we have to treat Blacks as if they're disabled. I.e., what she meant was we have to create a whole special legal system to accommodate, to ensure they can have access to the government and so forth. That is a different set of standards than that which the rest of the system has. So she's quite frank in that point, and it's been a comment that people have criticized online and such as it's circulated. But I actually think she's being very frank about that. She's saying there's a different standard that is required for one group of people, and we have a parallel here with buildings being required to set up wheelchair access and so forth. And that same standard means that we need to have special districts which are designed for this other subset of people. So that's what she means when she's saying that blacks are disabled. Of course, the connotations of that, right, come, I think, very clear and hit very hard from what I'm calling a more post-war liberal view, because obviously if you're using that kind of language, you're like, well, but I thought we're all equal before the law. And I thought, especially on this matter of race, this is a point where we wanted to insist very, very clearly for some time that there are no differences between the races that are meaningful before the law, that there's no superiority or inferiority, right? And what she's doing there is she's rejecting all that language, right? She's saying that doesn't matter anymore.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and just to double down and return to this point of how we got here, the capture, I think it's fair to say, of countless institutions and the intrusion upon civil society and the market by this sort of illiberal or post-liberal approach in which neutrality is no longer the goal, but a kind of scale tipping, if you will. It's all of these institutional changes that in some cases were not necessarily driven so much by the internal logic of how liberal ideas unfold, but to other things. I want to make sure I have that.
Yeah, I definitely think that one of the points that's been very useful from the more theoretical discussion, the one that I've been a little more critical of in our conversation here, but one of the points that has been useful is you can't really effect a neutrality principle. You cannot really live by that. Eventually, you're going to start ranking and prioritizing, and especially when it comes to one of the ways neutrality is supposed to be operative. We can have a political community where we allow for we don't have to articulate any substantive vision of the good. We set that all aside and we come to agree on a lower level. Well, hold on, isn't that a particular substantive vision of the good to say that we can all agree or all should agree, right, on this lower standard? Doesn't that carry with it some more substantive principles? It's not just a procedural commitment. It's an agreement to agree to disagree about what's important, right?
Yeah.
Which itself requires us to rank and prioritize what we think is important. And that's where the critics of liberalism that I think you're referring to have been very, very helpful in ensuring, or at least confirming for us, that a lot what was promised in this paradigm can't work. Mm-hmm. Now, though, but what you mentioned kind of post-liberalism, liberalism here. What I would say is the working out of what I'm calling asymmetrical multiculturalism, what Eric Kaufman calls and others, is in many ways the kind of system that does govern most Western countries. The US is a bit of an outlier right now, but if we go to the Equality Act in Britain, where, say, the majority white British is not a protected category, right? Then we see how that kind of post-liberal system operates, where you have to have, as is the British experience right now, right? You have to start policing online speech much, much more, because it's starting to run up against multiculturalism, the multicultural commitment to ensure a peaceful and orderly, multi-ethnic, multicultural society. And if you have people online who are criticizing that, who are attacking it, then that becomes a public order issue. Um, and so you have to recalibrate your old system of rights and subordinate them to the new demands of multiculturalism. So that is a post-liberalism that's at work, right? It's a progressive post-liberalism. It's a multicultural post-liberalism. It trends in an illiberal direction insofar as it'll eventually require, as it does right now in British, right? It requires you to be arrested for making jokes, right? The experience of not a few people, a couple comedians recently. So it trends in a liberal direction insofar as it takes what was a key liberal right, freedom of speech, and says actually that's not really that important anymore. We're
Yeah, I think we see the dynamic at play very clearly in the migration question, which Western countries around the world are facing right now, and it's this tension between on the one hand the liberal neutrality, the emphasis on autonomy and liberty are fundamental, and so everyone's liberty and autonomy is equal to a certain extent, and one can't help but realize that that is not the case, and so it's a natural thing to kind of to preserve that, to have to play a greater and greater policing function, and so now we've seen over time, Canada to a lesser extent, but increasingly so in the last 4 or 5 years. Immigration has become a major issue. We seem to be unable to put limits on it. It's just kind of increased and increased and increased, and we're seeing that really come to a boiling point in the United States and the UK and other European countries in more significant ways. So, how do you think about the migration question as it relates to your thesis about the development of liberalism into where we are today?
Well, yeah, it's a great question. A couple of points to make. One is it fits into this paradigm of asymmetrical multiculturalism in a lot of ways because uh, many countries around the world speak of immigration just in terms of economic benefits. We need to ensure that we have, use a Canadian example, right? The points-based system set up in such a way that we're talking about bringing other groups in. We're just doing so for economic reasons. But very few countries actually exercise that principle and apply it specifically, right? Most countries have a system of family migration, chain migration. And what that does and enables is a public rhetoric that talks about how important it is to bring in a particular culture to keep sustaining and enriching the national fabric, right? The language, diversity is our strength. Dan Quayle uses it, Vice President of George Bush Sr. Brian Mulroney used it in the mid 1980s. And it's an embrace of how important it is to bring new cultures in, and again, to ensure the state system sets it up and supports it. So I think it's very, very hard to argue that we ever had a point, or at least especially in the past 40 years or so, where we viewed immigration solely through the lens of economic benefits. People made the argument, but if you looked at what the actual policies were and the kind of rhetoric that was used to justify them or prevent the policies being criticized, then people quickly latched on to the language of asymmetrical multiculturalism. That's one point. Second point is that the way you described the way autonomy works out as a kind of a liberal application of this here. People should have the freedom to move around, maybe. So we talk about autonomy in that sense, autonomy in terms of freedom of mobility. Well, we've already changed the definition of liberalism there than what it once was, because for many of early modernity's theorists of liberalism, what matters is social contract. That's how you get to have consent of the governed, right? That's key. And the definition that you propose there, very much a definition that's in vogue in the air. I'm not criticizing you for bringing that forward, but has dropped out the other part of it. And this is another aspect that we see play out in the migration debate, is that people are not asked what they actually want. And it's important to see here that consent to the governed and a social contract would, if you applied that principle as it appears in Locke and other thinkers, right? If you're adding new members to society, you need to get the approval of society to ensure that happens, right?
Mm-hmm.
Use a simple contractual analogy, right? If we're making a business agreement uh, and we want to bring another party in, we mutually need to agree to bring a third party in. You can't just walk in and be like, "I've invited my friend, by the way, and he's going to have 20% of the ownership of the
Mm-hmm.
of what we're talking about," right? That would be breach of the terms of contract. That intuition is right there in the model that early modern liberals advanced for what social contract requires. So, in the past few years, in the past few decades, really, we've stopped consulting the people on this question. We've pushed it out of the realm of democratic politics, and here's where the courts matter, into the realm of judicial administrative decisions, where the judges are tasked with enforcing the bounds of this, and uh, preventing people from leaving. It all becomes a matter of judicial review. So this is that's, I think, the third point that I want to make here is, in the absence of, or in the change of our understanding of what constitutes liberalism, even for people who tend to want higher levels of mass migration, but are a little suspicious of perhaps of some of the asymmetrical multiculturalism stuff. The ones who say points-based system, we need a points-based system, we need more high-quality workers, et cetera. Well, they're still complicit in an order that has transferred a lot of the decisions for immigration, say around asylum policy or something or like that, to judges and administrative courts, where they are shielded from democratic accountability and democratic change. And that's very much the British problem right now. And that's why it's become effectively a mainstream position in Britain. All the parties, even the Labour Party, are talking about how we need to reform our relationship with the European Court on Human Rights, who are the judges who set asylum policy, right? That make it possible for someone to land in Britain, immediately say, "I'm here on asylum," and then that person can't be touched, and the state has to provide that person with housing until their asylum case is heard, right? That's the
Mm-hmm.
European Court of Human Rights that is imposing that upon the British government. And until you change that relationship with the European Court of Human Rights, that's the law you're going to be stuck with. So the most extreme proposal would be to leave it entirely. The other proposal would be to try to carve out maybe exemptions, or say we're not going to abide by decisions on that, do something like that.
Mm-hmm.
But be as it may, that's the kind of order that we see come out. So mass migration requires you to change the way you are governed to make it work, right? The people
Yeah.
who want even more of it and like that system want to give even more power to the judges and to the administrative courts,
Yeah.
and let them decide everything that is important. So I think it's a real good kind of tip of the iceberg for our deeper political problems, for showing how our institutions have changed, how we're not governed the same way that we were 50 years ago, and many of the ways we think we are governed, or by which we think we are governed, aren't actually true anymore.
Yeah. So I suppose, yeah, this gets nicely at your thesis that we're actually existing in a post liberal state, because although many of the same institutions still exist, they behave very differently. And there's the question, though, of this further so these institutions could be used to kind of try to shore up the existing, let's call it, mutated form of liberalism that tries to put the thumb more so on the scale to try to preserve this, this very liberal, neutral sphere, um, but does so in increasingly illiberal ways, versus this desire on the other hand, by those on the right and the left, to kind of do away with some of the aspects of liberalism that have been, let's say, corrosive to morality, to common culture, to civic life, to these sorts of things. The really kind of fundamentalist commitment to these ideas of unrestrained freedom. Help me distinguish those. So there's this idea that you put forward, that we have actually existing, a kind of post-liberal institutional order. On the one hand, it's kind of trying to shore up this form of left liberalism, but then on the other, there are these pushes to use the state more, let's say, just one example, to direct it in a more non-liberal way, for lack of a better word. How do you understand those two dynamics? How would you characterize the landscape right
Yeah,
now?
so what I'm interested in is getting a better diagnostic about what's changed. That's the when I use the term actually existing post-liberalism, I'm saying that there's a theoretical discussion of people who have these debates, liberalism, illiberalism, post-liberalism, but there's the way our institutions actually work here and now. And that's what I mean by actually existing. So I'm thinking about how they've changed and draw attention to that. Now, I think that's important because you can take this in one of two ways, and this is what's at issue, right? It's important to get the sense of our diagnostic, right, so we know what levers we need to pull or can pull to reverse some of these changes, and which ones cannot, which ones we've gone too far down that trying to recall it or go back, put the genie back in the bottle would be preposterous. A simple example of that has been more or less the case since 1973, when all the countries have, or most countries, went on to floating their currency. No one seriously thinks we're going to be able to sit down again and bring back the order of Bretton Woods and have fixed currency and get the United States government to guarantee all exchange of the US dollar backed by gold, right? We're just not going back to that world. It would be preposterous to think of things like that. But here's where I think where there are the more contentious points of debate right now, right, is on some issues I would agree more with what we quote unquote say are liberals, right, perhaps our classical liberals, that say on free speech issues, that we should be thinking very, very hard about rolling back, countering institutions that are damaging free speech, that are making it more and more impossible to exercise that.
Mm-hmm.
So this would be shot across the bow at governments that are trying to coerce online platforms, say,
Mm-hmm.
to monitor their content and remove any content that is deemed unlawful or unacceptable.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's an attack on political speech that we can point at. The Digital Services Act, say, in the European Union. We can point at the Online Safety Act in the United Kingdom and challenge that at that point. So that's a point that I think my argument would be very much along the lines of what a lot of classical liberals would want. What I want them to realize is you can debate all you want about how important classical liberalism is, but it doesn't describe our institutions anymore. And you actually need to adopt, if you're really serious about your classical liberalism, you need to adopt a counter-revolutionary posture and begin to look at the way we are actually governed and say these institutions should be burnt to the ground. We should take the DSA out into the streets and light it on fire, right, in Brussels, and countries should break away from that. Same thing in the European or in the United Kingdom. The other kind of post-liberalism that you alluded to are those who I think are talking more about how to meet the demands of the common good. We need to recognize the greater role for the state, say a greater role for muscular government, and I think a lot of these have to be handled on a case-by-case issue as to what we're actually talking about.
Mm-hmm.
They're correct insofar as this is the way that a lot of our institutions already operate, and we're already working in this paradigm.
Mm-hmm.
They're not correct if they assume that every single one of those institutions has to be there and has to exist. To use an American example, right? The United States has a federal Department of Education that was established under Carter. Conservatives long railed against it. It was long assumed that you couldn't do anything about it, though, or at least to the past. I don't know. People just assumed you can't touch this. And we see that we actually do have an administration that is capable of rolling that back. It may not be able to formally abolish it, but you don't have to actually to give it money. You don't have to actually give it the resources to run. You can hollow out its core. That would be a case, and I think there are very good reasons to that, which we could go into. But that would be a case whereby, if those reasons are correct, then the proper attitude is not to talk about more use of state power. It's to recognize that this use of state power this use of federal government resources, of having an administrative department for that, doesn't actually serve the common good.
Mm.
And so we have to walk away from that. But our post-liberals, the people who maybe they're Catholic post-liberals, maybe other conservative post-liberals, are often looking at and debating those kinds of institutions. They're having a debate with classical liberals about the role of government. And my argument to them is sometimes they'll be right, often they'll be right. But we should be very specific about what we're actually looking at, what kind of institutions we're talking about. I think some we can find that are very bad and should be removed.
Mm-hmm.
Some state institutions, some are very bad, but their function can be changed.
Mm-hmm.
We can do better things with it, and some aren't actually doing bad things at all, and just need to have some better personnel at the top.
Okay, so a case-by-case approach, not a single or few theoretical principles to apply across the board. I want to ask you because I think there are some salutary elements, certainly, of this of post-liberal type institutional reform or cultural reform, and then some very concerning ones. So the concerning ones, we've talked about both already, but the concerns are authoritarianism, a kind of rigidity, imposition, and then on the positive side, it's anthropologically speaking, people need many sorts of things to flourish in life, including common values, and certain lifestyles, behaviors, beliefs, etc., are just not conducive. Society will not last, very long. If we don't, perhaps prioritize marriage and family, just to give one example. And so, in light of that characterization, and I think your rightful, cautious case by case approach, what would you say governments across the Western world, and give some Canadian examples, maybe should focus on and be wary of, in addition to what you've already said?
Well, here's where I think the post-liberal framework that has brought us is very, very helpful. We should be thinking about what is the common good, and trying to articulate what that is for our particular national community. So now here's, I think, perhaps where the specifics come about. I mean, we really have to, and Canadians have gone very, very far along this path, and they have to turn back and run away from it. The notion that Canada is a post-national community, a kind of special economic zone where anyone can come and go as he, she, they, them pleases, right? But that is an ideological project to deconstruct the Canadian national community. And it has been something that's been going on for a long time, but it's been deeply pernicious to the human flourishing of ordinary Canadians and of the communities of which they are part. So I think that's one direction that one can go, is trying to think about the national space and the national community, and ask what are the kinds of policies that best help Canadians, whether it's economic policies, or whether it's the kinds of laws that are better suited to meet the needs of Canadians. So that would be one aspect. I think that a lot of the other problems that are facing Western countries, Canada's certainly facing them, but a couple ones that we're going to need real hard long-term thinking about is the fertility crisis. Fertility rates are lower in Canada than they are in the United States, and are accelerating. The concern about housing is a major issue. And I think here we have to understand that this is an issue that has been aggravated by mass immigration. So it's tough for a lot of Canadians to see, because it's been wrapped up with Canada's identity, and its way of distinguishing itself from, say, the United States is to have had for a long time extremely generous, over-generous immigration policy. That has to be reversed and brought to an end as quickly as possible, or there will be no possibility for the younger generation to enjoy the standards of living that their parents did. And it'll make Canada a much more ironically, right, much more unattractive country for people who do want to immigrate, as is already becoming the case, by the way. We can find public polling on this that says that a lot of immigrants who end up in Canada find the cost of living to be too high, find it not a very happy, welcoming place, and would rather be in the United States, right? So those are some of the issues. I think going beyond that, we need to think about the economic arrangements that now here this isn't so much about the national community, but this is about local communities that are beneficial for a particular local environment, that help restore some of the bonds of solidarity. I think that's an important principle that works, but also you need subsidiarity as well. And here's where the Canadian system, when it comes to its federalism, I think is actually a very good example. I would actually say, I live in the US now. I love the US, but the American federalism has broken down in a lot of ways. And Canadian federalism, in some respects, is a stronger system. I think it draws the boundaries between the provinces and the federal government a little better. In some instances, and that's something that one can start developing, I think, and seeing more and more. The other thing too, and maybe this is just the fact that I grew up in Alberta, but I do think it's important, is that in the kind of world in which we're now moving into, we see how important it's a material world. We see how important material supply chains are. We see how important critical resources are to having a healthy, functioning, flourishing economy. Finance can't just do it all. That means that Toronto can't just do it all. So we need to have the capacity, I think, to recognize the natural resources that Canada has and ensure that they are properly developed. And this is something that, because of the hold that the Greater Toronto Area has and the kind of thinking that comes from the people who grew up in that, I refer here to the Laurentian elite, right? They've really put a strangle on what the rest of the country is capable of. So I would submit our political task, if you will, for Canada is to weaken the power of that group more and more. Such that the potential that exists in the rest of the country that is there, whether in resource development or in other subjects, can actually take off. And it's going to be a hard political rearrangement. Maybe it's going to involve some renegotiation of the terms of confederation in very stark ways. But if we're going to be able to talk about Canada as a national bloc, as a nation, as a real country, one with deep ties of solidarity, and not just as a special economic zone in 50 years, that's what is going to happen. Otherwise, we will have the Laurentian elites, like the elite in Brussels, dragging the rest of their bloc down on a kind of suicide pact that is unable to face the problems of the nation in the eye and refuses to look at them while the blood of the nation slowly sips out and we slowly die. I really think the choice is as stark as that.
Yeah, well, there's certainly a much greater awareness of the importance of these issues. They're no longer theoretical and abstract. People feel it. People feel the pinch. And very provocative, very thoughtful discussion. Nathan, thank you for joining us. Fascinating discussion on the future of politics, identity, national and individual, and the liberal order. If you enjoyed this episode, please like, subscribe, and share it with someone who also might find it thought-provoking. For the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, I'm Peter Copeland. Thanks for listening to Inside Policy Talks. Thanks for joining us, Nathan.
Thank you.